Welcome back. It's been yet another busy news week, both locally and internationally. From the deadly floods in the Eastern Cape, the return of South African soldiers from the war-torn Eastern DRC, to the escalating tensions between Israel and Iran. Tshwane University of Technology political analyst Dr. Levi Ndou is joining us this evening, as well as the University of South Africa's Professor Dirk Kotze is joining us, and will be later joined by the University of Pretoria's Center for Study of the United States Director, Mr. Christopher Isiki. In fact, he is with us already. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this evening as we are having this discussion, unpacking some of those top stories, as I mentioned, that have happened locally and internationally. And perhaps let's begin locally. I mean, something that really has gripped many South Africans are the floods that have taken place in the Eastern Cape. Dr. Ndou, perhaps maybe let's just start with you. In terms of seeing the response that we've seen from government in how quickly they were able to assist those that have been affected by these floods. I mean, that number of people that have lost their lives is now currently sitting at 88.
Good evening, Katlego. Good evening to the viewers and my fellow panelists. I think this is a very sad moment, first of all, not only for the people of the Eastern Cape, but also for the entire South African population, that we have lost many lives, and we still have a lot of people that are quite frustrated and not knowing what has happened to their loved ones. The response by government, in my view, appears to have been very swift. They seem to be able to do all they could with the conditions in that area. And the cooperation, of course, from the ordinary citizens in that area that are working together with those that are assisting them. And my view is that that is where we actually need government to be able to respond as fast as possible in situations similar to this one. But I've got a view that I think as communities, as government, we need to share. Government needs to stamp its authority on matters that relates to where people are supposed to live in a manner that will provide sufficient security for these people. Government should be at the forefront of stamping its authority in ensuring that we do not have this kind of disasters happening, especially when ordinary people are actually occupying land in areas where they're not supposed to be living. And my view is that this should be a learning curve for those that are given responsibilities to run the country, to ensure that in situations like this one, we could actually be able to do much better.
Most certainly. Prof. Isiki, I mean, when you look at it from an international perspective point, especially when it comes to that government response, when other countries are looking in terms of how authorities respond in situations where they really don't have any control over, because this is a climate change issue where we are seeing floods, even though there were some of those warnings. What perception does it put out there for South Africa as a country?
Look, like you said, it's a natural disaster. There's not much countries can really do to prepare for things that are unexpected. The important thing is to have the infrastructure in place for a responsible response, if you can call it that. And I think that that's what the government has done in the light of this situation.
And Prof. Dirk, maybe let's bring you in, Prof. Kotze. Dr. Ndou spoke about government having to stamp its authority, especially when it comes to where people build. We heard the Minister of Kokta quite early on when the floods started speaking about people that built on the floodplains, and how a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the disaster is because of such instances where people have built in incorrect places. Do you find that we are reactive as a government as opposed to ensuring that these people are not building where they're not supposed to in the first place?
Yes, I think so. And I think this is events like what we see now that really makes the local authorities aware of this, because it is in essence and responsibility of local authorities. They are the ones who deal with spatial development, where people can build and what they can build there. It is very well known normally over a long period where is the flood line. and where the persons are not supposed to build anymore. Then on top of that is what we have seen at the time of the COVID, and that is the different disaster management infrastructures at national level, provincial level, and local level. So I think what hasn't been activated maybe sufficiently is those structures, because that will also bring in then support from the provincial level when it's necessary, and even from the national level. And I think what is also something that we've picked up in this case is how civil society organizations, for example, the Gift of the Givers, how much they have assisted in this process. And I think this is something which is very positive. But you can't rely on that all the time. It must come in the first instance from official government institutions that does that coordination role or plays that coordination role. So I think to a large extent it is a very serious lesson that they have learned. But I think in places like, for example, KwaZulu-Natal, they are now much more sensitive or aware of these risks. And I think they are already in a better position as a result of the lessons that they've learned.
Speaking of those lessons that have been learnt, Dr. Ndo, and just how KZN is more responsive because of their past experience, the COGTA Minister also made mention of communication and how this time it was done differently, it was done well in advance, in order for people to be able to respond in time when these floods are coming. But a lot of the people also in the Eastern Cape are saying that, but because there's no electricity, they don't have access to radio and television sets, and therefore that communication could have fallen through the cracks at some point. Where do you think service delivery sort of gives a ripple effect when we are then faced with such disasters?
As I said earlier, these are good lessons for all of us to be able to respond to this kind of situations in a much better way, even though government is applauded for having done much better in this situation. It is time now for elected leaders, especially at local level, the councillors in the ward committees, those that are leading civic organizations, to be able to constantly communicate with each other so that situations like these ones should actually be dealt with accordingly. You need those that are dealing with issues of disaster to be able to communicate with communities on a regular basis so that when there is time for these people to move away from such areas in situations like this one, they should quickly be communicated to and they should actually be saved. Yes, indeed, the spokesperson of the Eastern Cape government was saying that they cannot provide some of the services to some of the areas because such areas are not supposed to be occupied by people. But I think those that are elected into positions at local level, in the civic organizations, in the different state committees, there should be a way in which they constantly communicate with each other so that we do not have the loss of lives as we experienced over this week.
Prof. Kotse, what's your take in terms of that multidisciplinary interventions that need to take place between, like you mentioned, civil society really took on the bull by its horns in this situation and assisted quite a lot. Should we be seeing more interventions beforehand between government and civil society that can better prepare us for such disasters?
Yes, I think this will always be very important. I think we have a very good weather prediction system. So that is not that they were caught unaware. There was already predictions that there will be severe weather in that region. And therefore, then immediately when that becomes available, that information, then the different role players must come together. As I've indicated, the idea of disaster management is something which is in terms of law, in terms of legislation. It is already available. It should just be activated. And I think this is where there should be more forward-looking planning that must take place, and evacuations that must take place. We must not wait until it starts to rain before the response is activated. So I think, again, this is some of the important lessons that hopefully the different communities will learn But other areas that are seeing what has happened now, for example, in the Eastern Cape, will try to avoid in their own areas also.
Most certainly. Well, one other topic, gentlemen, that has been hot on the heels of many South Africans this week has that been of the national dialogue. We saw the president officially announcing some of those imminent persons who will form part of a conversation with many South Africans, putting forward what it is that their day-to-day struggles and societal ills are in order for us to be able to move forward as a country. This national dialogue being scheduled for the 15th of August. Prof. Isike, what's your take on this approach in terms of bringing a nation together and having these conversations?
Well, this is a very good development for South Africa, especially because of the history of state formation in the continent. I've always argued that the states in Africa, we don't have what we call the African state, because what we know today as the modern state in Africa are imposed political communities that did not have any kind of people involvement in how those states were formed. And as a result, no social contract per se. And South Africa has been one of the few countries in Africa that had some kind of social people participation in the formation of the state. If you look at the CODESA of 1994, and then thereafter, there's been a lot of challenges, especially the economic ones, that have made people to call for a second CODESA, one to address some of the economic challenges the country has been facing. And based on studies that I've done in the past, a majority of South Africans favor that this kind of national dialogue that would be an opportunity for different interest groups within the country to come together and forge that social contract, one that will address some of the questions around legitimacy of the state, responsibility of the states, and then from there, once you have that in place, and with the people behind a government, you can then forge that national compact that the president talked about, and can be a driver for a new and reimagined South Africa. This is crucial if you look at the role of people participation in state formation, in forging patriotism for the state, and rallying around behind the government of the state to achieve its responsibilities, because there is no way you can achieve anything you want to achieve, whether it's a national development plan, without buy-in from the people. And I think that this national dialogue gives South Africa the opportunity to do that.
Prof. Kotse, Prof. Isike speaks of that social contract between a state and its people and getting that buy-in and having them involved. But we've also gotten a lot of criticism, especially from opposition political parties, the Action SA leader saying that it is out of touch with South Africans. The president should rather come to the ground and have these conversations and have these dialogues with people on the ground, and that people are tired of conversations and are wanting to see more action. Do you think South Africans would participate in a way that the state would then get buy-in from the very people it's trying to serve?
Yes, this is a bit of a complex question because it will depend very much on, first of all, how it is ultimately presented to the public, and then to what extent the public will have confidence in this process. I think I fully agree with Professor Isike of how important it is, and that it can also be implemented in different components of our society. For example, in many parts of the world, take for example Japan, Germany, Singapore, and others, where there's the so-called, in some cases, there's the idea of a developmental state. Part of that developmental state is exactly this type of dialogue, especially between the government and the private sector, the business community. But in our case, because of the issues that we are confronted with about crime, about unemployment, and many other socioeconomic issues, it is important to have a sense of going back, in a sense, to where the negotiations of the 1990s came to an end, as well as, for example, the TRC, the Truth Commission, that there's many people who criticize it because there wasn't a follow-up. There wasn't a way in taking it further than the formal processes of these institutions or these events that happen. So I think there is certainly a need for that. I think what should be avoided is that it becomes a political discussion, a dialogue between mainly the politicians. And secondly, I think what should also be avoided is that it is only done at the elite, at the national level. I personally would like to promote the idea that it should also be conducted at lower levels of society, even maybe at local level, because then the idea of a convergence of networks that can be developed, of trust that can be built amongst people, will be more likely than when it is only done at the national level.
Dr. Ndo, I mean, Prof speaks about avoiding a political and elite discussion, and I seen you there agreeing when he made that statement. Do you think South Africans still have that appetite to sit and discuss what it is that is really facing them on a daily basis?
We are a nation of dialogue. We are a nation of consultation. We are a nation of wanting to solve the challenges that we have. My approach to the national dialogue is that government appears to be saying politicians have been given a lot of time to deal with your challenges. Of course, you have elected people to represent you in the different spheres of government, but you also need to give an opportunity to ordinary citizens to come in and air their views. And I want to support what my two panelists have actually indicated, that it should not just be left to the elites. Ordinary citizens should have their voices heard on the challenges that are facing the country, and they should be given sufficient opportunity to air their views and suggestions on how we're supposed to move forward. The lucky that we have is that we all know the challenges that we have as South Africans. These are the challenges that are spoken about on a regular basis when the president is addressing the nation in what is referred to as the State of the Nation address. And what most people have indicated is that we have had a lot of talk from politicians, and this is the right time for ordinary citizens to be consulted and also indeed to air their views. And my view is that if the approach and the implementation thereof is spot on, we'll therefore be able, in my view, to get to the bottom of all our challenges, and indeed more proposals and suggestions could come out of this national dialogue. And I know that the government officials, the president himself is aware that there should be sufficient consultation and everybody should feel free to make proposals and suggestions so that indeed the views of everyone should actually be embraced.
And truly be reflected. Gentlemen, let's hold it there for now. We're going to take a quick ad break, but when we do return, we'll be speaking about the return of the South African soldiers from the DRC and also the airstrikes that we are seeing between Israel and Iran. So do stay with us. You can also send us your WhatsApps as well as give us your calls as we recap the top stories of the week. Let's take a quick break. We'll be back after this. Welcome back. We continue our discussion with political analyst Dr. Levi Ndo, who's a political analyst rather, and then the University of South Africa's Professor Dirk Coetzee, as well as the international relations expert Professor Christopher Isika. Thank you, gentlemen, for staying with us as we're recapping the top stories of this week. Now, the Defence Minister saw the welcoming of 249 South African troops back from the DRC. This is one that was really welcomed not only by South Africans, I can believe by many of their family members as well, quite long awaited. Prof, maybe we can start with you with regards to the return of the soldiers. It was quite a bumpy ride on day one. We expected them around midday. They only arrived much later in the evening. But surely South Africans, as well as more especially the soldiers themselves, are happy to be back on home soil.
Yes, I think this is
Apologies. Prof Coetzee, you may continue. I forget that I've got two profs with me this evening.
Yes, I think it is a huge relief that the first group is back in South Africa. This whole exercise has become a logistical, I would almost say, nightmare for many. starting with SADC, South Africa itself, and then the other components of it, and ultimately Tanzania. The repatriation has become a very elaborate process, and I think this is a bit of a reflection on the cooperation within Southern Africa, first of all, but for example, the African Union also. One hardly hears any assistance being provided by the African Union for this repatriation. I think it has been a lesson for South Africa that's about the complications of such a mission. So the South African forces were in the part for many years part of the United Nations MONUSCO peacekeeping force, but not SADC per se. And I think the fact that the SADC one was such a very slim grouping of only 3 countries out of the 16 of SADC, in a sense, sort of set them up almost for failure. There was simply not enough support. They were not strong enough, and that the overwhelming strength of the M23 rebels, supported mainly by Rwanda, made it an impossible task. And I think this is what the South African Defence Force, National Defence Force, is possibly have learned now already, is that one either go in very well prepared and very well resourced, or you don't go in there at all. So I think I think that they are going to have a period of reflection in order what to do in future, because this is a key component of South Africa's foreign policy. South Africa wants to be involved in missions like this as part of its broader policy, specifically with Africa, about peacekeeping, about peacemaking, about promoting a post-conflict reconstruction process. So it cannot walk away from it. But the military component of it and the fact that it is not well enough resourced, I think, is now being the big issue that they will have to reconsider very carefully.
Prof Isika, I mean, Prof Kotze speaks about the AU and its non-involvement in ensuring that the South African soldiers are brought back home. What can we see out of the relationship between Rwanda, Tanzania, South Africa, and many of those countries that were involved in the SADC mission, especially in now seeing the soldiers having come back to South Africa?
Well, look, it's a good thing that the soldiers are back and that the government listened to pressure from home. So there's a bit of democracy, the beauty of democracy around that when governments, accede to the local population to take foreign policy decisions that have security implications. And maybe I dare say that this is perhaps one of the things we expect from the national dialogue, a clear definition of South Africa's personality, character, its principles, and its focus, its Afrocentric character of its foreign policy. These things need to be well defined by South Africa, and then to ensure that there is a balance between these principles, this national interest, and its foreign policy behavior. Otherwise, we'll see a situation where sometimes the vested interest or the idiosyncrasies of presidents can make them take decisions that that are not well thought out, and may ones that they will come to regret in the future. I would think that once that is the case, South Africa, of course, it wants to play a role in these things. It wants to be a regional leader, but for a country that focuses on mediation and dialogue to resolve international conflict, being involved in regional conflicts as this one are things that need to be well thought out, and one that the country needs to be prepared for to avoid an embarrassment. And of course, if you look at its relationship with Rwanda, the kind of Cold War South Africa has with Rwanda may have also played a role in how these played out eventually. So all I would say is that it's a win for democracy that the government decided to listen to the people and bring back the soldiers. And like Prof. Kotze has said, there will be time for reflection to analyze what should have happened, what went wrong, and how to do this better in the future.
Most certainly. Well, we do have a caller on the line, Sifudi from Randfontein. A very good evening to you. What are your thoughts?
Evening to you, Katlego, and your guest.
Evening, Sifudi. What are your comments or questions this evening?
You know, Katlego, I'm gobsmacked by your guest. Do we need a dialogue to deal with the bread and butter issues of this country? Do we need a dialogue to deal with law and order in this country? Do we need a dialogue to deal with porous borders? Do we need a dialogue for South African to be prioritized? Do we need this country? Katlego, it was defined around between 1990 and 94 to be a democratic, non-sexist state. 1996, they adopted the economic system. Should it take more than 24 years for us to realize it? This is a subterfuge to bring back those who have become irrelevant, who have messed up this country. And I'm disappointed because some of the experts believe in that. But to us on the ground, we've gone past that. We've reached a point of no return. Good evening to you.
Thank you so much, Sifudi, for your comments. Maybe let's bring you back in there, Prof. Isika. I know you've done quite extensive research on the national dialogue. Of course, Sifudi taking us back to our first discussion. And he's making mention of economic policies such as GEAR, prioritizing South Africans, the bread and butter issues, the porous borders that South Africans are currently experiencing. Do we need a national dialogue to solve all of those issues?
Well, the fact that he's asking the question of whether we need this dialogue to address this bread and butter, these basic governance policy issues, is precisely why we need this dialogue, because it tells us that there's been a failure of governance and state, and that stems mainly from the fact that the states, as we have it in South Africa and elsewhere in the continent, were never designed to be developmental by the Europeans in the first place. They were supposed to be platforms for exploitation, for facilitating exploitation. So they were never developmental in the same way that the states were created to be so in Europe and America. Now, we adopted them without asking ourselves whether we need to repurpose them for our needs. All right. So the fact that he's asking all of these questions show that there's been a failure of governance. There's been a failure of governance because we do not understand what the state and governance are supposed to be about. So this kind of national dialogue will help to rebuild political trust. This question is an indication of lack of political trust in the system. For you to have to build that political trust, you need to have dialogue with citizens, form a new social contract where government will be very clear about what it is supposed to do and what it's not supposed to do as the instrument of rule of law, and then we'll start all over again. State making is one part of it, but state building takes time. It's a process. The works of Francis Oyamjo have indicated that it's always an incomplete process, and we have to keep going and going until we get it right. There are many states elsewhere in the world, even the developed world, where some of these failures continue to happen, even in the United States. But what do? They have found ways of dealing with them because they have a social contract, a social compact that everyone gets back to. So I would say, yes, we do need the dialogue. And this particular dialogue, the president has said, is going to be inclusive of everyone in society, different interest groups. I mean, take a look at the eminent persons group that is appointed. You have film actors, producers, soccer coaches, reverend, outside the usual political class. So I think that we should give it a chance and forge that contract so that people like this scholar will begin to have trust again, because the state will be seen as legitimate and we can all put our hands on deck to build the country as it should be.
Speaking of trust, one aspect of trust is voters putting their trust in political parties, and those political parties putting people in parliament to represent them. And now this week we saw the move of Liam Jacobs from the Democratic Alliance to the Patriotic Alliance. And Dr. Ndo, I'm going to bring you in here because on Tuesday we saw within the portfolio committee in Parliament, Liam Jacobs, taking on the Minister of Sports, Arts and Culture, Gayton McKenzie, who's also the president of the Patriotic Alliance. And this was over the appointments of the National Arts Council board members that are affiliated to the Patriotic Alliance, speaking there about where are the checks and balances. The lead interviewer in these board interviews was a PA member. The person who becomes chairperson is from the PA, and then the minister is also a member of the PA. What does this tell us in terms of such moves of political leaders from one party to another, especially in times where there's so much robust debate in Parliament about the preference of certain political parties and having people sit in certain positions?
It might have come as a surprise that Jacobs has decided to leave the DA for the PA. But I think we need to acknowledge the fact that it's a normal activity in politics, that politicians will move from one party to the other, and indeed at times not expected. In the life of our democracy in South Africa, we have seen politicians moving from one party to the other, up to an extent where Parliament has had to come up with a regulation that was talking to floor-crossing law, that politicians should therefore be allowed to move from one party to the other, and at the time they do not have to lose their seats in Parliament. And at that period, we saw a lot of politicians moving from one party to the other. We have seen leaders like Patricia de Lille moving from one party to the other, and those are some of the people that have actually normalized this arrangement. We have seen Floyd Shivambu, we have seen Dalimpofu leaving the EFF to the MK party. Now it's also happening with Jacobs leaving the DA to the Patriotic Alliance. We are still going to expect many other politicians to move from one party to the other. This is what democracy is all about: the freedom of choice, the freedom of association, and indeed exercising your democratic right to belong to a political party or to get out of that political party. And I know that some people could see this as a betrayal. They would say it talks to people who are not sure about their political standpoint. But in this political life, people have got all the freedom in the world to change their allegiance and indeed leave the political parties that we never thought that they'll leave and join other political parties. But it also talks to the abandonment of ideologies or ideological association by politicians, because to a certain extent, you would identify certain individuals with political party A, and they'll actually give you a huge surprise, like we're actually witnessing with the other politicians in South Africa.
Most certainly. We are running out of time, so I'm going to move quite swiftly in terms of what's happening further afield. Prof. Isika, I mean, we're seeing the strikes between Iran and Israel, and US President Donald Trump also gave his expressions there, saying that he gives full support for Israel's actions, also warning Iran that it can avoid further destruction by agreeing to a nuclear deal.
Well, yes, he gave that initially when he saw how successful the initial attacks on Friday of the Israelis on Iran, who were, caught unawares because they were not expecting any kind of attack, especially on of their, sixth round of discussions with the Americans. And that was a fatal mistake. And of course, they were caught unawares, and we saw the results of that. However, within 18 hours, we've seen the Iranians regroup, get back their air systems, and have been able to fire 3 to 4 barrages of missiles, on the Israelis. And we've seen President Trump just late yesterday and today, continue to go back foot on and deny that America had nothing to do with this, but of course also warning the Iranians not to target American interests.
Most certainly. Well, gentlemen, let's hold it there. We're going to take a quick break and then we'll wrap up after When we return from the break, we're going for a quick one. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back. We're wrapping up our discussion on the top stories of the week with our professors and Dr. Ndo. Prof. Kotse, maybe let's just get your final thoughts, especially when it comes to the issue of Iran and Israel. We saw that, the Israeli strikes really targeted the Iran's defense ministry, seemingly having an indication that the Israeli intelligence has penetrated Iran at the highest of levels. The Iranian foreign minister has come out and saying that the U.S. needs to take the same amount of accountability and responsibility for these attacks. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I think what we should have the perspective that this is not something out of the blue now. These type of attacks actually started in April last year already, when the Israelis attacked the Iranian diplomatic mission in Damascus, in Syria. Thereafter, there was retaliation 2 weeks later. And then in July, Israel assassinated the leader of Hamas in Tehran. And then in October, there was again a retaliation by Iran. So this is, in a sense, the pattern that developed now. But I think what is very significant for the moment is these nuclear negotiations. And what President Trump indicated is that he does not see enough progress from the side of the Iranians in these talks. So I think Israel saw that as a go-ahead in order to continue with this, in order to put pressure on Iran in order to reach ultimately an agreement on the negotiations with respect to limitations on nuclear development. So I think this is the component that we have to take into account. It's very similar to the way in which Israel also acted against Hezbollah in the southern part of Lebanon, of sort of targeted attacks, not a general attacks like in Gaza. I don't think they want to try to repeat what is in Gaza. The international response is far too negative and critical for that. So at this stage, I think it has become now a head-on-head situation, confrontation between Israel and Iran. Because ultimately, if you want to try to define the relationships of that whole part of the Middle East as well as Iran and others, is that ultimately it boils down to a power competition, a power test between Israel and Iran on both sides, and to what extent they will be able to have nuclear powers on both sides also.
And Dr. Ndo, very quickly and just lastly, with the issue of Iran and Israel, we are seeing that this is really impacting very heavily on Iran's already sanctioned energy industry that could affect global markets. How do you think this could affect us as Africa and as South Africa as a whole?
The situation between Israel and Iran has a potential to trigger other countries to be on either on the side of Israel or on the side of Iran. My view is that because we saw it coming, it is time now for our leaders in the different international bodies to come together and act to end this kind of conflict. If this is allowed to continue, it might have serious, devastating consequences. And I don't think that is where we want to see ourselves at reaching that stage. My view is that leaders should stand up, do what they can to stop what is happening in that side of the world.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time this evening. Prof. Christopher Isike, Prof. Dirk Kotse, and Dr. Levi Ndo, thank you so much for joining us this evening and wrapping up all of those top stories with us tonight. All right, and that's how we wrap up this part of today's session of the top stories of the week. You can also send us your questions or comments as we continue with more stories and your headlines at the top of the next hour. Do stay with us.